The 1960s was a pretty eventful decade. 3 presidents, the Vietnam War, the student anti-war protests, the assassination of JFK, the migrant worker rights movement, and mainly the 1960s women's rights movement. Women at the time had an Equal Pay Act, protested against nuclear tests, and speech on different genders and different wages.
Women's rights have always been an issue in our country. What happened before 1960 was unfair and unjust. After the Second World War and the Great Depression, families became more of a priority and the glue to a new American way. Women were expected to be merely housewives and caretakers during this time. They didn't have a voice or a choice. The women's job was to feed their husbands when they got home from work, have the house spotless, and take care of the children. They had to bury their dreams of becoming something else other than a housewife. In the 1920s, the percentage of women who went to college was 47%, but then in the 1950s, the percentage went drastically down, all the way to 38%. Women were denied higher education and knowledge, which would limit their power and choice. Are the rights of all people equal? Was there something done to control the number of power men had over women? From 1960 to 1969, there was much more conflict over the rights of women. There were protests, campaigns, acts, and so much more being done to complete and have equal stands for every race and gender. Unfortunately, not everyone agreed, and they had a negative opinion towards the process of Americans. For example, there was the bombing of 16th Street Baptist Church and also Birmingham Campaign of 1963. Women from the 1960s were inspired by the women who tried to fight for their rights in the 1800s. They wanted to earn the right to have a voice for themselves and just have more freedom. 1963 was probably one of the most difficult times during the fight for rights for all genders and race. In 1963, Congress passed an act that was very discriminatory against women. The act was called the Equal Pay Act of 1963. What it did was make the right to pay a woman less money for doing the same job as a man. The Equal Pay Act allowed employers not to hire a woman because of their gender. Also, in 1963, there was a bombing in a church that pushed to change society in the way they think. On a Sunday morning, there was 4 girls in a basement in the women's room waiting for the service to start. The bomb that was thrown by the KKK was unexpected and just a surprise for many people. Sadly, none of the girls survived. In 1963, Congress passed another law that was called the Civil Rights Act. Basically, what it did was abolish or disagree with discrimination based on their color, race, religion, sex, or ethnicity. The Civil Rights Act was a huge step forward for the rights of women. Women started to have a voice slowly. In October 1966, a new association was formed and called the National Organization for Women, also known as the NOW Association. The association was made up of both men and women. The founder, Betty, was secretly inviting 15 women to her hotel room and planned out how to effectively do something about their rights.
Even though we have reached the end of this wave, it sure is the beginning of another. In the end of the 1960s, a pageant took place. This pageant was labeled as the 1968 Miss America Pageant Protest. No men were allowed to interview, act, or be in or out of the event. 100 women were included in this protest, and the cause was to show physical attractiveness and charm as the primary measure of a woman's worth. The women had made sure to be prepared for arrests that needed to be made at any time during their protest. Since the second wave had become such a success, the third wave began in the 1990s to better their equality and power.
I've got some habits, even
After the 1960s, women's civil rights movement, advocates for women's rights have made progress in passing other laws. Congress passed the Equal Pay Act in 1963, making it illegal to pay a woman less to do the same job as a man. A year later, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This act prohibits employers from discriminating against an individual on the basis of race. The law also states that employers cannot discriminate against someone on the basis of gender. The effects following this revolution have been to give more civil rights to women, but not only that, also as regards the black population, there's been an evolution. In fact, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 granted African Americans equal access to restaurants, transportation, and other public facilities. It has enabled blacks, women, and other minorities to break down barriers in the workplace. And it has also made the approval of integrated school for South America and North Africans.
So I tried.
After the women's rights movement of the 60s, many different laws that stopped discrimination towards women were still being passed. Laws and actions such as the Education Amendments prohibiting sex discrimination in all aspects of education programs, the Supreme Court ruling Roe v. Wade, discrimination on basis of sex, and credit discrimination against women are outlawed by Congress. Since different laws were still being passed, the women's rights movement didn't stop there. Women still didn't have the same rights as men. Due to women still lacking rights after the women's rights movement, aka the second wave of feminism, it started the third wave of feminism. Here is a pen with pro-abortion propaganda from 1981 that was made to show support for keeping abortions legal. Due to abortion still being controversial today and people trying to pass laws that make abortion almost impossible, here's a poster from 2021 that has the same slogan from the pen in 1981. Laws like equal pay were still trying to be fought for in the 90s. In this letter, First Lady Hillary Clinton wrote in 1995, she is talking about women barely surviving on low wages. Even though the women's rights movement feels like it never ended, the 60s women's rights movement provided many progressive laws to be passed and prepared a whole new generation how to continuously fight for their rights.
Our topic relates to debate and diplomacy because for centuries, women have had to fight to try and prove we should be treated equally to men. In the 1900s, women came together to try and fight for equal rights as men. Women were tired of unequal pay, unequal work and education opportunities, being viewed as objects or breeders, and being judged solely based on their gender. In the 1960s, a second wave of protests and debates began. Women from all over the world came together to fight over a common cause. During the Women's Strike for Peace, 50,000 women marched over the nuclear weapon testing site in order to protest the Vietnam War and to protect their families from the nuclear fallout. Women have overall proved time and time again that we can do anything and deserve to be treated as so. By looking at major events such as the Women's Strike for Peace, one can see how the women's rights movement of the 1960s shows a fight for equality about debate and diplomacy in history.
A woman's place is in the home, and I suppose as long as she's in the home, she might as well be in the kitchen.